As part of our series looking at events that changed the world, we turn our attention to food security and the European Union's policy change on genetic modification, or GMOs. It's easy to forget today that the availability and pricing of food was once much more problematic than it currently is. To take a closer look at the evolution of this issue, we have Minister Christina Fuller from Brussels, who was at the forefront of the policy change back in 2013. And will tell us more in a few minutes about why a handful of far-sighted politicians decided to move forward. Also, our journalist David Green will take us to meet Food for All campaigner Kate Tiverton. But first, let's take a look back.
Today we take it for granted that we face far fewer food shortages around the world. Affordable food is more plentiful than in the recent past, and thanks to growing more of our own food, European food imports have a smaller carbon and water footprint. In the first decades of this century, efforts to increase food supply were hampered by volatile climatic events, unstable political regimes, and our own habits, like wasting food. Meanwhile, the population was increasing exponentially. Today, there are 9 billion people on our planet, while there were only 6 billion at the turn of the century. We realised we couldn't maintain the status quo. Something had to change.
Something had to change. Well, Minister Christina Fuller, you followed and battled for this issue when it was at the heart of heated debates almost 40 years ago. What was the situation then?
Well, food availability and pricing had become the biggest global issues at the turn of the century. Dramatic and devastating spikes in the price of food affected people who needed it most. Climate change's impact on harvests certainly didn't help. European consumers still did not realise the impact of wasting food, much of which relied on land and water in developing countries. Also, Europeans were sceptical of the benefits of using GM crops, even though these plants could cut farmers' fuel costs, lower carbon emissions and resist water shortages. European farmers were effectively banned from using one of the tools that could have made a difference.
Minister Fuller, you and your supporters were facing a lot of political resistance. Why were you convinced it was necessary to push for change?
Well, we as Europeans realised that we had a responsibility to help relieve the pressure on the rest of the world by taking action. 3 actions were essential. We needed to reduce our food waste, lower our CO2 emissions and produce more food on less land. We realised that GM crops could help improve food security, even if they were not the silver bullet. A group of citizens, scientists and farmers from across the EU called Think Again GM came together and asked me what to do and what was right. Europe's position on GM was harming developing countries, whose governments looked to Europe to set the tone.
Well, alongside the facts provided by Minister Fuller, we also wanted to see for ourselves what the reality on the ground is. Now let's turn to David, who's taking us to a GM maize field on a Belgian farm.
In 2013, Europe's politicians adopted a policy that allowed most of Europe's farmers to plant genetically modified crops. Along with other tools and practices, this move helped to change the face of the agricultural landscape. 40 years ago, it would have been impossible to create the crop yield and quality of this maize field here today without technological innovations. Yet at the time, politicians encountered resistance, not least from activists.
Thank you very much. Kate, your organisation, Food for All, is one of the major organisations fighting world hunger. Looking back, why did food activists change their minds?
What changed was experience with the passing of time. The extreme stories that some organisations predicted about the negative aspects of GM food simply didn't materialise. Instead, millions of small farmers planted GM crops across the globe, which increased food production. European farmers wanted to remain competitive and make a profit, of course, but their planting of GM crops also had a knock-on effect. Europeans started using fewer natural resources in developing countries because they could produce more food for their own needs. Of course, this wasn't the only factor that helped global food security, but it certainly was an important one.
How do you explain that food activists were so reluctant to support this change and the benefits that came with it?
When GMOs were first introduced in the mid-1990s, when food was relatively plentiful, there was an understandable reticence to accept that science could play an important role in ensuring food security. And some activists whipped up a media frenzy that poisoned any reasonable debate in Europe for many years. To put it simply, David, we almost got it wrong. And an initial understandable concern about new technology turned into an unfounded hysteria until it became clear that this opposition was harming the very people we wanted to help.
So, what made European governments carry out this reform despite such a hostile climate?
Well, since Christina Fuller is with us, let's ask her. Minister Fuller, why did politicians follow through with such a politically risky yet necessary change?
Well, we knew what we had to do. We knew that genetically modified foods could not eradicate world hunger on their own, but they could play a part in alleviating it. And for once we got it right. Hunger is still an issue and unfortunately it's not likely to go away in the immediate future. With the world's population continuing to rise and available agricultural land shrinking, the pressure to get the most from our land remains strong. And as I said, climate disasters haven't gone away, but at least we're better able to deal with their impact on food now than we were 40 years ago because we used all the tools available to us.
Thank you, Minister Fuller.
Alongside other measures, this critical piece of policy helped change the face of European agriculture. So, journalists do report good news sometimes.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Minister Fuller, for joining us today to remember this historical turning point. Now, on to our next story. Malta has qualified for the Football World Cup finals for the first time. Europeans are watching their champions closely as they face off against Ghana, 2 times World Cup champions. Let's go to our correspondent live in Dubai.